So there are these two guys named Posner and Dodd. I think one of them is still at it. One of them is kind of like an old boxer. He's semi-retired. He goes down, around in the CLE circuit at various conferences, and he presents on cross-examination, what all of you are learning today, okay? They came up, Dodd and Posner, with the chapter method. The chapter method is really a way of organizing cross-examination. It's a way of chunking it out so that you can address every single topic that you want to get to, okay? So I'd like a volunteer to go ahead and read the affidavit of the detective and read it. Go ahead and read it, and I'll stop you from time to time. So who wants to read the affidavit? Who's brave enough? And speak loudly, please. Who has the courage? You have the courage? Okay, come up to the, you want to come up and read it? Oh, look at this guy. He's got it. Here, come up to the front. Come up to the front. All right, now project. You match my volume. Yeah, you read the whole thing and I'll stop you from time to time. Project, man. You got it.
My name is Dana Hughes.
Little louder.
I am a detective with the Metropolitan Police Department in New Columbia. I have been a police officer for 17 years and a detective for the past 6 years. On December 24th, 2020, I received a call from dispatch that someone had been shot at 1799 Lamont Street, Northwest. The call came at 10:33 p.m. I radioed back that I was in the area and could respond and asked for backup. I arrived at 1799 Lamont Street, Northwest at 10:38 p.m. A crowd had gathered in front of the house, and as I approached the front door, an unidentified woman said to me that the people in the neighborhood were always calling the police about fights between Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, and that this time Donovan finally went and done it.
Okay, so let's stop. So you can stop right there. Feel free to stay where you're at. What did we just learn? We learned something incredibly important. She says, an unidentified woman said to me that people in the neighborhood were always calling the police about fights between Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, and that this time Donovan, the husband, went and done it. He finally went and done it. And what do we think the witness means by finally went and done it?
He killed Dominic Stevens.
He killed his wife. Okay? Now, I want to home in on the word here, unidentified woman. Now, go to the front page of this packet. Okay? Go to the front page of this packet, the table of contents. Do we see anywhere on this witness list this unidentified person from the crowd? No, we don't, do we? Do we? Because that person is unidentified. Does the officer in the statement say anything about interviewing that person, talking to that person? No. So let's make one of our chapters, okay, one of the things we're going to ask about, let's make one of our chapters the unidentified person. That's one of our chapters. And then we'll have a series of questions about the unidentified person, and we can talk about what those might be. And then we'll move on to another chapter. And here's how we transition between chapters. You can transition a whole bunch of ways, but typically lawyers do it like this. Okay, now I'd like to move on to this, or now I'd like to talk to you about this, or can we talk about this? So you go from one chapter to another with transitions, and you immediately follow the transition with a question. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your statement. Okay? Yes. All right, so in your statement, so that would be an example of a transition. Now, I want you to go ahead and read from I knocked on the door. Go ahead and read and project loud, like you're angry, you're yelling at your mom. She wants you to clean your room, and you don't want to. Go ahead.
I knocked on the door and it was open.
A little louder than that, man. Come on, project, man, project. Match my volume.
I knocked on the door and it was opened by the defendant, Dominique Stevens. She was dressed in her bedclothes. I identified myself as a police detective, and she led me upstairs to a bedroom. On the bed was an adult male lying face down, covered with a light blanket. The blanket had 3 holes in it and had some blood stains on it. I examined the man on the bed and determined that he was dead. He had been shot. I asked her what happened, and she said, "I shot my husband." She then pointed to a dresser standing across the room from the bed, on which I had found a .45 caliber pistol that had recently been fired. I read Mrs. Stevens her Miranda rights and handcuffed her.
Okay, right there. Perfect. Great job. So we learned something else. We learned something else now. Who can tell me what we learned in what he just read? Who can tell me what we learned? Important. It's subtle. It's subtle. What did we learn about Dominique? What kind of person is she when the officer came? How did she act? Well, I mean, you say she acted like she didn't do anything. That's one interpretation. But maybe think about, what didn't she do? Was she angry with the police officer? Did she resist? So what was she then?
She was like relieved.
I don't know if she was relieved. She was calm. She was calm. There's a word that we use a lot in police encounters. It starts with a C.
Compliant.
Compliant. Okay. The other word is cooperative. She was compliant and cooperative. And we like that alliteration, compliant and cooperative. Lawyers love alliteration. Your Honor, she was compliant and cooperative. That sounds good. So let's make that our next chapter. Compliant and cooperative. She was compliant. No. Here's what we'll do. Here's what we'll do. All 3 of you just made this up. I'm going to use this in the mock trial. She was calm. She was compliant. And she was cooperative. Boom. All right, that sounds good. When you get something that sounds good, use it. Worked for Johnny Cochran, can work for us. So we're going to talk about the fact that...
Do you all remember who Johnny Cochran was?
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. O.J. Simpson? Yeah. So let's go ahead and also the other thing is, she found a gun that had recently been fired. I mean, this is nitpicky, and I don't think we want to go this route. How the heck does she know the gun had recently been fired? I don't know a bunch about the science of guns, but was there residue? Were there powder burns somewhere? Was the barrel hot? Could it have been hot, still after maybe, it took her 10, 15 minutes to get there? I mean, is she just playing? Is she just guessing? Go ahead and if you would answer the door. If you'd answer the door. Elena, go ahead. See where you're at. So that's what we learned. Now, if you would continue reading, please, the statement as we walk downstairs and project.
As we walked downstairs, 2 children came out of one of the other bedrooms. They were crying and ran to Mrs. Stevens. I asked if they were her children and if there was anyone who could take care of them. Miss Stevens appeared to be very disoriented and didn't answer. She was just sort of staring off into the distance.
A little louder.
I repeated the question, and she responded that now that it was all over, she wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. She was shaking and started crying. At that point, another person arrived at the house. She identified herself as Jordan Bright, Mrs. Stevens' sibling. Jordan said, "I was afraid something had happened, so I came over to check everything out." Jordan agreed to take care of the children since Mrs. Stevens was unable to do so herself.
Okay. So what did we just learn regarding the children? There's an important fact that we can use about the children here. They came crying. And what else? Where were they? At the scene, but where in the house were they? In the same room. The detective makes it a point to say they came out of the same room. Not from their 2 different rooms, but from the same room, like they had been hiding together. That's important. So a chapter here is going to be, we'll call it chapter of the children. The children. Okay? And there's something else, there's a bad fact here. There's a really bad fact here for us. There's something that makes her look very bad. What could it be? What's the bad fact here? I'll give you a hint. It's in the first paragraph on page 10. What could it be?
She wouldn't have to worry.
Go ahead and read that part.
She wouldn't have to worry.
Loudly, please. Match my tone. Match my tone.
She wouldn't have to worry about them anymore.
Okay, she wouldn't have to, now that it was all over, she wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. And she did this in response when the cop asked her, you know, do you have anyone that can take care of your children? And she said, now that it's all over, she wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. The prosecution's going to spin it like this. She meant now that she was going to go to jail, she didn't have to worry about her kids anymore. Or they're going to spin it one of a bunch of different ways to try to get that to an admission of guilt. Okay? We need to explain that. We need to have an alternate explanation for that bad fact. We have to add it to our story and explain it in a way that the jury will think it's a good fact for us. Who has an idea about how we might do that? When she said she wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. Think hard. Remember, she was a wife that had been abused, right? Her husband beat her. She had kids. Think about how we can spin this fact. I know some of you are already thinking about the right answer. You just have to have the courage to say it. Think about it. She was abused by her husband. She had kids. And the statement she makes when the cop says, do you have someone to take care of your kids, is, now that it's all over, now that I killed my husband, I won't have to worry about them anymore. I won't have to worry about them anymore. How could we explain that in a way that's favorable to us? Take some guesses. Take some guesses. Come on.
Oh, I know.
You know?
I think she mean like they wouldn't be like abused. Or
Say that louder. Loud, loud, loud.
They wouldn't be abused by the husband. Or,
Yes. We can say she was saying that she was relieved, finally, that she wouldn't have to worry about the safety of her children anymore. That's what we can say. The prosecution can say what they want. But we have got a very sympathetic client who cares about her children. Her children run up to her as she's being arrested, and this is what happens. We can argue that what she was saying, and remember, she's going to take the stand, so she can say this as well. She was concerned for her children. That's what she meant in this statement. Now, then we get into the stuff about her siblings showing up. That'll come up later. Go ahead and say, after placing Mrs. Stevens in the police cruiser.
After placing Mrs. Stevens in the police cruiser, I returned to the house and conducted a search. There were no signs of a struggle in the house, although Mrs. Stevens appeared to have several bruises on her face. I asked her where they came from, and she said she had been in an accident. I offered to call an ambulance, and she refused, saying that she did not need to see a doctor. Later, at the police station, I learned that Mrs. Stevens made the 911 call. I again advised Mrs. Stevens of her Miranda rights and asked her if she would be willing to answer some questions. At first, she was like a zombie staring off into space, but I asked again and she agreed. This is an open and shut case.
Okay. There are two good facts for us here. The first is that, let's see, she appeared to have several bruises on her face. So we're going to get the officer to admit and say, she had several, when you saw her, she had several bruises on her face, right? Yes. Now, the officer asked her where they came from, and Dominique said she had been in an accident. Now, again, it's not common, and we've got an expert who will say this. We have an expert who will testify to this, that it's not common for victims of not uncommon for victims of domestic violence, when they get injured by their husband or by their spouse, to blame it on something else. I fell down the stairs. I tripped. I ran into something. It's not uncommon for them to make that excuse rather than admit that they were being abused, because it's a horrible, painful thing to admit that somebody that you love, someone you were going to spend the rest of your life with, the father of your kids, abused you. Okay? That's a favorable fact for us, for the defense. The other thing here is this is an open and shut case. Before the officer even talked to our client, she made the statement in an affidavit that said, this is an open and shut case. That's a closed mind. That's somebody who's ready to rush to judgment. That's somebody who has made up their mind in advance about what this is, and that is going to color the way that she looks at the rest of this investigation without even talking to the victim. Okay? That's her bias. It highlights the officer's bias. Now, go ahead and read the next paragraph.
Some weeks later, in doing some paperwork for the case, I came across police records indicating that there had been several complaints filed by neighbors which described fights between Mr. and Mrs. Stevens and screams coming from the house. According to the police reports, officers responded each time, but no one at the house ever filed any charges. I know that now she's claiming she killed him in self-defense because of battered woman syndrome.
You can stop right there. So, I'm going to go ahead and put these into chapters here. So one chapter is going to be the injuries she had. Okay, injuries on her face. A few questions on that. The other chapter is going to be that, let's see, the complaints from the neighbors. Complaints from the neighbors. We're going to ask some questions about that. And there's some other facts that we just learned that we can add to these other chapters. We learned that she agreed to talk to the police. Where does that go in these chapters here? Where does that fit in? She agreed to talk to the police. Yes, calm, compliant, and cooperative. Okay, we also learned that, let's see. Said there were no signs of struggle in the house. We might be able to get and ask, it's tricky because the fact pattern doesn't give us a lot. I think it would be difficult in one night without experts to determine whether there were signs of struggle in the house. But that's something we don't know. And in cross-examination, we try to stray away from asking questions that we don't know the answer to, especially in mock trial where if we ask a question outside the fact pattern, they can make up a fact that's favorable to their side. So let's stick to the fact pattern here. So go ahead and read the final part here. I know now that she's claiming.
I know now that she's claiming she killed him in self-defense because of battered woman syndrome. In my opinion, it's just a new excuse for committing murder. She never said anything about being beaten to me. I saw some bruises on her, but she said she was fine, and how am I supposed to tell one bruise from another? Anyway, there's not much police or the courts can do in cases like that. At some point in time, the woman has to decide to leave.
So, the chapter here is the officer opinion on domestic violence. This should shock you. This is a cop. What should shock you about this? About what the cop said on the last page? Should absolutely shock you.
Somebody say something.
It's the last sentence.
At some point in time.
Project loud, loud.
At some point in time, the woman has to decide to leave.
Yes, at some point in time, the woman has to decide to leave. The woman who's been beaten, victimized, her children threatened, that woman has to decide to leave. It's on her. Who knows, there's a term for that. Who knows what that's called? When someone looks at the victim and says, it's your fault.
Lack of sympathy.
Kind of gaslighting. What'd you say?
Like, no sympathy.
No sympathy, that's true. Victim blaming. Now, there's some other shocking thing in the first part of that sentence. What is it?
The police report reviewing cases like this.
Could you repeat that and project and match my volume?
anyway, there's not much the police or the court can do in cases like that.
There's not much the police or the courts can do in cases like that. That is shocking. She takes all the responsibility off of the whole police department, off of the courts, both of whom are designed to protect and to achieve justice, takes all of their responsibility and puts it on this woman, the one who's abused and is a victim of domestic violence. That should be shocking. So in closing argument, who can give me an example of what I'm going to get up and argue? Because remember this other fact. In the packet, it says the police had been to her house several times already. 3 or 4 times. But no charges were filed and no one was arrested. So in closing arguments, what am I going to quote and what am I going to say? What's going to be my argument in closing?
Let me hear from one of y'all too. Y'all in the class too.
What?
Go ahead, put your headphones back in. Hey, one of y'all over here. What's your last name? What's your last name?
What?
What is your last name?
Hernandez.
Thank you. Let me hear from one of y'all 4. Right over here. Hola. Somebody right here. Answer this question.
So I'll say it again. I'll say it again for everybody. So the question here is, remember, the police had been to her house several times in the past because of complaints. No one was arrested, okay? No charges were filed. You have a cop here who just said there's not much the police or the courts can do in cases like that. At some point in time, the woman has to decide to leave. When I get up in closing argument to argue to the jury why she decided to kill her husband instead of go to the police, what am I going to say? She didn't have any other option. And what am I going to use as evidence to support that? The officer's statement. And here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to probably say something like this. I'm going to say, I'll add as many facts as I can. Police officer for 17 years, detective for 6 years. What's 17 plus 6? 23? Okay, bad at math, sorry. So I'd say a 23-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Department. She said it best. Detective, and I'll say her name, Detective so-and-so. She said it best. Anyway, there's not much the police or the courts can do in cases like that. At some point in time, the woman has to decide to leave. The system puts all the burden on victims of domestic violence. And this is why they feel so helpless, so trapped, and this is the key component of the Battered Woman Syndrome, the learned helplessness. And by then, we'll have addressed that. So, that will conclude this brief excerpt. I'm now going to play a video by Jerry Spence, kind of a lighthearted video on cross-examination. It'll show you a little bit of the basics, kind of funny. And if we have time, I'll play a little bit of a cross-examination from the good old Roy Black.